The Middle East currently sits atop a geopolitical powder keg, where the historical shadow war between regional titans has transitioned into a direct, high-stakes confrontation. The erosion of traditional deterrence, ranging from diplomatic backchannels to the presence of international peacekeeping forces, has created a vacuum where a single tactical error could ignite a continental firestorm. As non-state actors gain access to sophisticated ballistic technology and sovereign nations move toward open mobilization, the prospect of a localized clash evolving into a systemic explosion has become the primary concern for global intelligence agencies. This instability is no longer contained by geography. It is a pulse that vibrates through global stock markets, energy grids, and the very fabric of international maritime law, threatening to dismantle the post-Cold War security architecture in a matter of weeks. Today we will talk about what happens if Middle East tensions explode. So, before we start, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. What happens if Middle East tensions explode? If the simmering tensions in the Middle East were to explode into a full-scale regional war, the first and most devastating consequence would be a humanitarian catastrophe of an unprecedented scale. Unlike previous conflicts limited to specific borders, a modern explosion would involve high-intensity urban warfare across multiple nations simultaneously, including Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Densely populated metropolitan areas would become the primary theaters of operation, leading to the internal and external displacement of upwards of 40 to 50 million people. This mass migration would not only overwhelm the resources of neighboring states like Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt, but would also trigger a secondary refugee crisis in Europe and Central Asia, potentially destabilizing the political social fabric of those regions as they struggle to accommodate millions of traumatized civilians. The economic fallout of such an explosion would be centered on the total paralysis of the global energy jugular. The Middle East facilitates the transit of over 20% of the world's daily oil supply, and a significant portion of its liquefied natural gas, LNG. In a total war scenario, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow 21-mile wide waterway, would likely be mined or blockaded, effectively cutting off the energy exports of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran. Market analysts predict that such a disruption would cause Brent crude prices to skyrocket toward $200 per barrel almost overnight. This energy shock would lead to stagflation on a global scale, where the cost of living surges while economic growth grinds to a halt, hitting import-dependent nations in East Asia and the Eurozone with the force of a financial tsunami. Beyond energy, the explosion of Middle East tensions would result in the collapse of global maritime trade routes, specifically the Suez Canal and the Red Sea corridor. Approximately 12% of total global trade, including 30% of the world's container traffic, passes through these waters. If these routes become active combat zones, shipping companies would be forced to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. This detour adds roughly 3,500 nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to every journey between Asia and Europe, drastically increasing fuel consumption, labor costs, and insurance premiums. The result would be a global supply chain rupture, leading to shortages of everything, from automotive parts and semiconductors to life-saving pharmaceuticals, essentially bringing the just-in-time global economy to its knees. From a military and strategic perspective, the explosion would signify the first mass-scale drone and missile war in human history. The proliferation of low-cost, high-precision loitering munitions, suicide drones, and hypersonic ballistic missiles would render traditional air defense systems like the Iron Dome, Patriot, and S-400 vulnerable through saturation tactics. In this scenario, the cost of defense, firing a $2 million interceptor at a $20,000 drone, becomes economically unsustainable for even the wealthiest nations. This would lead to the widespread destruction of critical infrastructure, including electrical grids, telecommunications hubs, and water desalination plants. In the Gulf region specifically, where 90% of the drinking water is processed from the sea, the destruction of a few key desalination facilities would create an existential thirst crisis for millions within 48 hours. The geopolitical realignment following such an explosion would likely split the world into rigid, adversarial blocks. A direct conflict would force global superpowers, the United States, Russia, and China, to abandon their strategic ambiguity and commit massive military resources to the region. This would likely result in the formation of a Middle Eastern Iron Curtain, where trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange between the West and the axis of resistance are severed for decades. The United Nations and other international regulatory bodies would face total paralysis, as veto-wielding members fund opposing sides of the conflict. This breakdown of the rules-based international order would embolden other regional powers in the Indo-Pacific and Eastern Europe to settle their own territorial disputes by force, potentially leading to a Third World War. Furthermore, the environmental and agricultural impact of a Middle Eastern explosion would be felt in every corner of the planet. The region is a major exporter of phosphate and urea-based fertilizers, which are essential for global food production. A halt in these exports would lead to a dramatic decrease in crop yields in agricultural hubs, like Brazil, India, and the United States, causing global food prices to reach record highs. Environmentally, the scorched earth nature of modern warfare, combined with the potential for massive oil spills in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, would destroy some of the world's most unique marine ecosystems. Atmospheric pollution from burning oil refineries would create toxic plumes that could alter localized weather patterns, proving that the cost of war in the Middle East is paid by the global biosphere. In the digital realm, the explosion of tensions would involve a cyber calamity. The Middle East is a critical transit point for subsea fiber optic cables that link the internet infrastructure of the East and West. Sabotage of these cables or state-sponsored cyber attacks on global banking systems, SWIFT, and satellite communications would lead to massive blackouts in the digital economy. This would freeze international transactions, disrupt air traffic control, and potentially cause the collapse of digital currencies and stock exchanges. The explosion would thus not be limited to physical explosions, but would include the total silencing of a modern world's digital nervous system, leaving nations isolated and vulnerable to internal civil unrest. Ultimately, the long-term sociological impact would be the radicalization of a new generation. The trauma of wide-scale destruction and the perceived failure of international diplomacy would provide a fertile breeding ground for extremist ideologies that could plague the world for the next 50 years. The brain drain resulting from the flight of doctors, engineers, and educators would leave the Middle East in a state of intellectual poverty, making post-war reconstruction nearly impossible. The explosion of Middle East tensions is, therefore, not just a headline or a regional skirmish. It is a systemic threat to the survival of the interconnected modern world, representing a point of no return for 21st century civilization. If you like this video and would like to see more like it, please give it the thumbs up, leave a comment, and click the button to subscribe.